Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to be talking about positioning. Okay, first things first. One thing I wanted to really quickly call attention to is the importance of just using resources that you have available to you, such as like online guides. When you're looking at positioning, there's a lot of guides out there. Some of the ones I look at are TFT Tactics or Mobilytics. And when you're looking at team comps, you can see here that they have a recommended positioning, which is great for when you have a completed composition. It kind of gives you an idea of what you're trying to accomplish. For example, Mobilytics even will give you a guide and sometimes even explain some of the tips for your game plan, so on and so forth. But one thing that I take a look at sometimes is just, hey, this is the recommended positioning. Unfortunately, it doesn't really go too much into detail on why certain things are. So one of the things I want to cover in this video is just some basic tips and some fundamentals that hopefully should help you position better on the fly, and especially in the early and mid game when you don't have like a capped out comp. So let's start with positioning your backline. So most of the time you want to put your backline in a corner. So let's say you start out early game with like a sharpshooter pair and then maybe like a strong frontline unit. Let's say you find like Tahm Kench or something like that. What you generally want to do is put your primary DPS in the corner. And it can either be in the left corner or the right corner. It doesn't really matter too much. But generally speaking, you want the order of importance to be in the further corner. So let's say you have like a 2-star Vayne and a 1-star Nidalee. You're going to want to put the Vayne in the corner so that she dies last. So if people come down this way and everybody else dies, she has the most time to do damage. So that's why you want to put your primary DPS in the furthest back corner. Typically speaking, you can kind of spread out your front line in the first row. But if you're worried about assassins, let's say you have a 2-star Tahm Kench and like a 1-star Maokai. What you can actually do is put your Maokai in the back corner like this, and it'll act like assassin bait. So if they have assassins that jump into the backline, the Maokai will walk forward and tank the assassins, and that way it gives your protection for your backline. Generally speaking, you're going to want to lean towards a side. What you're going to want to do is take a look at which direction people are leaning, and then position your units towards one side or the other. When you do something like this, potentially what will happen is as this unit dies, if everybody else on this side, let's say their team is completely leaning to the left, if this unit dies and Tahm Kench is busy fighting somebody over here, the rest of the units will walk towards your backline, which is not what you really want. So if you position your units just one square over, this is more likely to be targeted by the rest of their team if Maokai dies. So that's why you want to kind of lean towards the side. So depending on what you feel the most comfortable with, if you have a really beefy front line, you can spread it out like this, or you can do, if you're doing a solo front line, if there's a unit that can solo front line, I would recommend going something like this. Speaking of solo front line, let's talk quickly about your front line positioning. Generally speaking, if you have a really strong front line unit, a lot of times, for example, Garen is a really good example of an early game unit that you want to solo frontline, because the way the units work is as they attack him, they'll move into the squares around him, and then he'll get a better spin-off. So if you can, you don't want to stack your units right next to each other. It's not super great to stack your units in the front line next to each other anyway, because it makes them really susceptible to AOE CC. So for example, let's say their team has like an Aurelia or something, or some other unit late game. When you stack your units up in a row like this, it makes it more likely for your entire front line to get hit by one CC move, which is not good. So generally speaking, you want to try and spread them out if you can. Obviously, if you're running like a full frontline team, that's not always possible. Or if you're playing with like a unit if you're playing with a item like Locket, you're going to want to keep your units stuck together, obviously. But sometimes this positioning is also okay, especially if you have a unit that really wants to be alone like Garen. When we're talking about frontline, I do want to really quickly talk about tanking sides. So generally speaking, when you have all your units stuck in a side like this, when you have all your units in a row like this, what's going to happen is the units on either side of the row are going to be really important. So let's take a look at like a duelist comp, for example. Okay, so let's say this is your board right now. You've got 4 duelists and you're running Enlightened. You've found a random Aurelia. When you position your units frontline like this, the units on either side are going to tank the most. So let's say they have a unit, let's say they have ranged units sitting in a back corner like this. This unit will attack the closest unit to it, which is usually the unit that's either in this position or this position, moving to the left, right? So if your Yasuo is like sitting in the corner, he's going to tank an entire side. If your Yasuo is like 1 star and you're trying to keep it alive, you're going to want to place it like not in the corner. So for Yasuo, you might want to put him back a row, just to help protect him a little bit and give him more time to DPS. If he is your chosen unit and you've got him stacked with items, then it's okay to have him tank one side because then he's pretty tanky. With Jax, let's say your Jax is upgraded but your Fiora is not, or maybe the other way around. Generally speaking, you want to make sure that you have your stronger unit on the outside, so it gives your inside units more time to attack because they're not going to be tanking as much damage. They might get aggroed by like 1 or 2 units here, but the backline units are not going to focus the ones in the middle. So you want to protect your squishier units in the middle and keep your tankier units on the side, so that way you can make sure that you're tanking one side. Units with like long AOE CC, like Aurelia, you want to make sure that they're in the corner. And the reason for that is because most of the time, people are going to be putting their sharpshooters or DPS in the corner. And if you put them in the front corner, Aurelia will actually hit the entire back row with her ultimate, which, you know, obviously CCs them and keeps them from attacking. The same goes for like Cassiopeia. The problem with Cassiopeia is that she's kind of squishy. So if she's only 1 star, you don't really want her in the front line. Usually you want to put her in a back line because it's more important that she casts once at least. It doesn't really matter too much what she's hitting, but if she's 2 star, you absolutely want her in the front and you want her in the corner because at that point you're going to be able to hit the entire backline, and then that's going to make sure that your Cassiopeia ults their entire team and then CCs their backline as well. Okay, so that's frontline, and we talked about backline. Assassins are usually pretty straightforward. You want to keep them in the backline. Let's see. Okay, let's say you have a really super basic 6 Warlord comp. You hit Katarina and you've got like a chosen Garen or something like that. This positioning, you're going to want to keep your Katarina generally in the middle for most of the game because you want her to jump in the middle of their team and ult as many people as possible. One thing that you can look for is towards the later portions of the game when there's less players in the lobby, you can start trying to move her towards either side. So let's say they have all their carries on their right side, then you can try and move her, edge her over a little bit to the right side so that when she jumps into the middle of their team, she's more likely to ult the carries in the corner. But for the early game, you generally want to just keep her in the middle, unless you're trying to do some kind of keeper buff. So let's say you have 2 keepers. When you're trying to position around keepers, generally speaking, it can be good to corner your units as well. The only problem is when you do something like this, it makes it kind of hard for some of the units to get out of the corner. So there's a trade-off. Sometimes you can put it in the middle like this, but if you want to give like your Nidalee a shield here or something like that, she's super exposed out here in the corner, in the middle. So this is kind of risky, so you kind of have to look around and see what other people are playing. If people are playing assassins, this is like really bad because they're going to just jump right behind her and kill your Nidalee off. So you can think about doing something like this. Okay, so this is a common example that you'll run into early on. So this is a keeper cultist opener with a Pyke, Elise, and Twist of Fate. A lot of times you're going to want to keep your keepers in kind of a diagonal arrangement like this so that you can get shields off on a unit here, a double shield off on another unit here. And so let's say you're running an assassin pair because you found like an early Akali, and she pairs nicely with Pyke. So in this situation, it's okay to put her in this spot right here because she's getting the double shields, and then she's going to jump off on one side. And then what happens is that because your team is leaning towards the right, Pyke is going to jump straight in the backline, and when Pyke ults, he ults diagonally across the board. And so what their team is going to do is their team is going to walk towards your team in sort of a diagonal fashion. And so because Pyke has a line ult, he's going to ult more people being this way than he is if he is jumping on the side. So let's say, for example, you put him here, right? Because their units are going to be spread out in a diagonal, if he's ulting across the diagonal, he's probably only going to hit 1 or 2 units. But if you can get him on this side and then ult across the diagonal this way, because their units are already positioned this way, he's more likely to hit 3, 4, maybe even 5 units. So that's why Pyke is usually in the opposite corner of your team, just because of the way his ult works. And that kind of brings me to talking about line ults and why you always want to position line ult units in the corner. So another example is, let's say Lux or Ezreal. The reason why you always want to have Lux and Ezreal in corners is because their ult travels in a line, and the way that the map works and the way that math works is that when you travel across a diagonal, you're going to hit more squares than if you hit straight because it's a longer line. If you can get your Lux or Ezreal to ult diagonally, you're going to cover more area and have a higher chance of hitting way more units. Which is really impactful. Also, most people like to lean towards the side and corner their units. So if you can keep your Lux in the opposite corner, then she's almost guaranteed to hit their backline carries, which is extremely powerful. So don't put your Lux in the middle. You're just wasting potential if you put your Lux in the middle. Oh, the same goes for Azir. Azir is another character with a really strong line ult. So you almost always want to put your Azir in the corner. But Azir is kind of special because one of the reasons you run Azir specifically is to protect your carries. So let's say you have carries, maybe late game carries. You put your Azir in the second row, and then oftentimes you put your soldiers in some kind of configuration around your carries to try and box them in and keep them safe from like assassins. And so because of that, you want Azir to be able to protect these people, still provide a line ult in the corner, and then hopefully peel for your backline units as much as possible. So you can do that in kind of any configuration, whether it's left corner or right corner. Both kind of work. So oftentimes you're going to be positioning your Azir like this if you're trying to protect your backline. Now, that's a Vine, not an Italy. Let's put Vayne in there. Anyway, so at this point, like let's say you're running sharpshooters, right? This is obviously only part of your comp. You have to evaluate whether it's more important to protect your backline from assassins or if you need more frontline. Let's say you, and this happens really commonly. Let's say you're running backline units, but you've been like picking up all these sharpshooters, but you have like no frontline. Let's say all you have is like a 1-star Sejuani. A lot of times in this situation, it can be really helpful to help bolster your frontline to protect your backline, because a lot of the times what happens is that your frontline just dies instantly, doesn't do anything, and then your backline just gets completely wrecked by all of their units because you didn't make enough time for your backline to DPS. So you have to kind of evaluate what you're missing, and that's one of the reasons why Azir is so powerful, because he's so flexible, and these minions can really just shore up wherever you're weak at. So, but let's say your frontline's like super covered. You've got like a 2-star Sejuani and like a strong Thresh, and you've got a bunch of backline units. You can kind of do something like this in order to make sure that you're protecting your backline. One thing that you should not do is to put your Azir soldiers like this directly in front of your carries, because oftentimes what will happen is if you do this, you have to make sure that your front line is leaning all the way over to the right, something like this. Because what will end up happening is that because this unit cannot move, it will actually stop attacking if it doesn't have range to hit anything. So let's say you have 2 units here and your backline kills these units, and then Sejuani walks forward towards their backline. All of a sudden your Vayne, maybe you're in Italy, are not even attacking anymore because they can't reach and they can't move. So what I like to do is swap these and do something like this or like this. What I'll have is like some kind of assassin bait here or a tankier unit out on this side to protect from units that are trying to come this way. And then what I'll do is I'll leave the Azir here as an outlet. So what happens is if everything starts moving that way, the Azir will walk forward and then the Vayne will be able to walk forward as well. And that means that your units can actually uncorner themselves if they need to in order to kill their units. So generally speaking, this is a much better arrangement than having the soldiers directly in front like this. So you generally don't want to do this. Okay, let's quickly talk about items. When you're trying to position around items, there's a couple different things that you can do. I'm going to use Moonlight as an example, Moonlight Aphelios. Let's say you have a chosen Lissandra. One of the reasons why this is such a good example is because a lot of times you're going to have like a Zeke's and a Chalice on your Kindred, because those are kind of the best in slot or items right now. Okay, so let's say you have Zeke's and Chalice on Lissandra or on Kindred, and then you have like a Locket on Lissandra. So one of the things you can do is actually backline all your units if you're running a Locket. A lot of times it can feel bad if you have a Locket on a unit that's like a frontline unit. So what you can do is if you do choose to make Locket early, is actually okay to backline all of your units and do something like this, where you're applying Locket to these 5 members of your team. And then you have, Zeke's and Chalice applying their buffs to these 2 units. And then your Aphelios is really safe. And what ends up happening is that these backline units start walking forward anyway. Let's say maybe it wasn't Lissandra, but like let's say you had another beefy unit that you were using here. Your backline units start walking forward anyway, so they end up intercepting people who are coming in. And because the Locket buff applies a shield to everybody, it's really valuable to have it in the backline. Like it's actually really good to backline your units sometimes. So this would be a fine positioning for like a Moonlight Hunter build, at least in the mid game. Maybe once you get further in the game, and you start adding in some late game units, then you add them to the front line. Let's say you start running like Divine or Adept frontline. You could do something like this, where you duo frontline, Shen and Yone, and then you have your backline covered like this. What you could even do, if you wanted to, is put the Lux over in this corner, because right now everything's leaning kind of towards the left, and as your units walk forward, you're going to kind of create a diagonal line like this. And sometimes what you might want is to have your Lux ult along that line, because if she's in this corner, she's going to ult opposite to that line. So it really kind of depends on how their enemy team is positioned. But yeah, you want to just pay attention and see which corner it's better to put Lux in. Okay, so let's talk quickly about how to protect your team against assassins, because that's one of the things that a lot of newer players struggle with a lot. So there's kind of 2 different ways you can protect against assassins, and it kind of depends on what your team comp looks like. So one way to protect against assassins is to backline your entire team. That usually works better when you have like 1 or 2 carries and then a bunch of really beefy units. What ends up happening is your backline carries sit in the corner or something like that, and as their assassins jump back, they start targeting all your beefy units. So this particular team comp is not actually really well suited for backlining, because as you can see here, actually more of my units are kind of squishy than they are beefy. So in this situation, what you'd want to do is bunch all your units in a corner, and kind of ball up your units a little bit, and maybe have your tankiest unit in the front here or something like this. And that way you're just trying to put as much power as you can in the corner on one side, directed outwards. That way your carry can potentially live the longest. Like in this situation, you have like Lux and Ezreal casting in the corner or casting diagonally, potentially weakening people with their ults, CCing, You have your hunters in the back here DPSing as much as they can, and then you have your Elderwood. This is just like a random mid-game example that you could use. So in this situation, I would probably do something like this. But let's say you're running like a bunch of brawlers instead. Okay, so let's say you have like this comp where you're running a bunch of brawlers. You have a brawler chosen, and you decided to add in an Ashe for the hunter bonus, and this is kind of your mid-game comp. If the enemy team is playing a lot of assassins, what you can just do is backline a lot of your units and maybe throw like 1 or 2 units in front here, so that if they jump in front here, they're going to end up targeting the Maokai. Maybe your tankier unit can go here just to protect. And then what ends up happening is that your the assassins jump into the backline, and all of your frontline DPS targets their assassins first, and then their assassins, which are usually pretty squishy anyway, end up dying first, and then you just deal with their frontline. The thing about assassins is that generally they thrive by jumping past your frontline, because frontline usually has all the CC, and so what they want to do, assassins want to do, is they want to jump past the frontline into your backline and deal damage to all your squishy carries uninterrupted. But if you have your backline here, what ends up happening is they'll jump into your backline, which is actually your frontline, and then they'll just get CC'd, and then they'll die pretty quickly because most of the time assassins have a hard time dealing with CC unless they have QS. But one thing to note is that Katarina doesn't really follow the same rules, because unlike other assassins like Zed and Akali, she has a big AoE effect. So what you're going to want to do when you're playing against a Katarina is just to look out for which side she's leaning towards. If your carry's in the corner and the Katarina is in the middle, she's going to jump into the middle, and then generally speaking, if she ults in the middle, like right here, she's actually not going to hit your back corner carry. So what you can do is just try to pay attention to which side the Katarina is leaning towards, because they're going to probably not want to stay in this square, but to move to like this square or this square just to try and target the backline. And then what you can do is you can just swap sides really quick. And then if you swap sides really quick, then the Katarina is going to miss. She's going to ult over here, and then she's not going to be able to kill your carry, and then your carry is going to kill her. So that kind of leads me to talking about sides and why sides are so important. While you're going through the game, you're going to really want to pay attention to sides. So when you scout, and this is one of the reasons why scouting is so important, you're going to want to make sure to keep these things in mind. Which side are people leaning towards? Obviously, you don't know who you're going to fight, and you can't predict exactly who you're going to fight. But the way it works is you can't fight the same person that you fought within the last 4 rounds. So you can kind of keep an eye on who you fought and who you haven't fought, and try and take a look at which side the folks that you haven't fought are leaning. And that way you want to either opposite side if you're trying to do kind of make a line. Like let's say you're playing Lux, because she's really popular right now. You're going to want to keep your Lux in the corner here, and then make sure she can ult and align across their team, right? Because if they're leaning like this, obviously a Lux ult is going to hit like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people potentially, which is way better than if the Lux was here and then she would hit like 2 people max. So that's one of the things you want to make sure you're paying attention to. Also, if you have your units cornered like this, I mean, you obviously don't want to have like your front line over on the other side, because people are going to just walk straight into your back line. Like let's say you have something like this, right? Their Yasuo, who's in this corner, is just going to go boop, 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 and then hit all your backline units, and you're going to cry. So obviously you're going to want to make sure that you're protecting your backline, same side. Oh, the last thing I want to talk about is just spreading units out against AoE. I touched on this earlier, but like, let's say you're playing against like, I don't know, an Ahri player who's like playing Ahri mages or Vanguard or something. It's not super popular, but when you have like spells that deal big AoE like that, obviously what you want to do is spread your units out. It's just something you can think about, whether it's Ahri or some other champion that hasn't come out yet in the future. Just make sure that you're paying attention to what's going on. And this is just another plug for scouting, and one of the reasons why scouting and looking at positioning, especially late game in the last couple of rounds when you come down to like top 4, the difference between like 4th place, well, really the difference between like 2nd place and 1st place is usually positioning, because at that point, a lot of the times it just comes down to who can position better. And it can be the difference between second place and first place. So to recap, just be sure to keep an eye on the resources that are available to you and make sure that you're looking at positioning guides for specific comps. These are super helpful, but you also have to keep in mind why certain comps are positioned, and hopefully the stuff we talked about today can help you kind of identify okay, so the reason why we want to spread out these frontline units is because we don't want all of our frontline to get CC'd. The reason why you would put Set in a corner is because you want him to ult in a certain direction. The reason why you put Lux and Ezreal in these opposite corners is because you want to make sure that they are ulting in lines specifically, and so on and so forth. Let's take a look at this comp. Okay, so we're protecting our Ashe. We are keeping our Yuumi as far away from the Ashe as possible so that the Yuumi will ult Ashe here. We're protecting our most valuable carry by putting her in the corner like that, and then our second most valuable carry is in the back line, because if everybody else dies, we want Ashe to be the last one alive so she can deal the most damage, as much damage as possible. Let's look at Dusk really quick. You want your carry here in the back line. You're going to put the Azir next to him to make sure that you can kind of peel this way. And then, of course, the Azir is you're trying to put them as far in the corner as possible. The Zilean also goes in this corner because you want to protect the Zilean to make sure he can cast, so on and so forth. Aatrox is an interesting one. You want to position your Aatrox as far away from your carries as possible, because what oftentimes can happen is that, let's say their backline jumps into your backline. When Aatrox ults, he will yank the assassins from these corners to the front line again, and make sure that he's peeling for your backline as well. I don't really agree with putting Cassiopeia in the middle like this. I know this is just kind of generic positioning, but what I like to do is to put Cassiopeia in the corner, like I talked about before, because oftentimes when she's frontline in the corner, she can ult the entire backline and make sure that she's hitting the carry. Because if you put her in the middle like this, yeah, she's CCing the entire frontline, but the backline is most likely not going to get CC'd, and that's what you really want to hit. If you can one-shot or deal a bunch of damage to their backline, you're really happy about Cassiopeia. And that's one of the reasons why she's so strong. Another reason why they have the units positioned like this is because of the Keeper buff. And that's why they have the ribbon between Aatrox and the Cassio. So if it were me, I would probably try and lean more towards the side. I would put Cassio either here, and then have these two units kind of in the same positioning like that. That's kind of what I would do. Obviously, a lot of these guides are super generic. They're trying to give you the best general positioning for in a vacuum. If you don't have any other information on the other teams, what's super general and pretty decent, but you're going to want to tweak this for what you see in your game, obviously. So okay, that's all I really wanted to talk about today. Hopefully you guys learned something, and I'll see you guys next time.